Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is October 29th. Well, as October is drawing to a close, the garden is whispering to us its autumn secrets through rustling leaves and the soft patter of acorns meeting the earth. I know up at the cabin, we always put our hammocks underneath the oak trees. And so as I was resting in one of the hammocks, we were replacing the outdoor string lights. I rolled out of the hammock and then promptly stepped on a carpet of acorns. It's just staggering how many acorns we have this year. Well, today we're embracing the wisdom of A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh, who wrote, "The end of summer is not the end of the world. Here's to October." Well, my October to-do list is winding down, and this week reads like a love letter to winter preparation. I've ordered the firewood to be delivered at the end of the week. My compost piles are awaiting their final turn of the year. And then later today, I plan on making my pilgrimage to our local yard waste facility before it closes its gates for winter in November. Now, before we get into today's botanical history, I wanted to share a few excerpts for you that were written on this day in a variety of different garden journals and diaries. This first excerpt is from Vita Sackville West, from her book called In Your Garden. And this is her excerpt from October 29th, 1950. And I love how she starts this out. She writes, "October is the time for the garden to be taken to pieces and replanted, if necessary, for next year. It's also the month that ushers in the long, dark evenings when one makes seed lists under the lamp. Pure pleasure and no worry. No slugs, no rabbits, no moles, no frosts, no damping off." And then she writes, "An interesting and unusual plant which should find a place is Cobea scandens, which sounds more attractive under its English name of cups and saucers. This is a climber, and an exceedingly rapid one. It will scramble 8 to 10 feet high in the course of a single summer." And then she goes on to recommend a rose. She writes, "If you are now thinking that a half-hardy annual such as Cobea scandens is too much trouble, do consider the rose called Nevada. It got an award of merit from the RHS in 1949 and well deserved it. This is not a climber, but a shrubby type, forming an arching bush up to 7 or 8 feet high, smothered with great single white flowers with a center of golden stamens." She writes, "One becomes confused among the multitude of roses, I know. But Nevada is really so magnificent that you cannot afford to overlook her. A snowstorm in summer, as her name implies, and so little bother. No pruning, no staking, no tying, and nearly as thornless as dear old Zephyrine Druhan," another type of rose. And then she ends with this sentence, "No scent, I'm afraid. She is for the eye, not for the nose." Very sweet. So a little rose recommendation from Vita Sackville West. And then here's a quick little entry that I like from Susan Wittig Elbert. And this is from her book called An Extraordinary Year of Ordinary Days. One of my favorite little books. I just love everything that she's written. But here's what she wrote for October 29th. And I'm just checking here really quick. This book was published in 2010. So she probably wrote this the year before, in 2009. "Indian summer, cool, crisp days, cooler nights. The cedar elms and the pecans are turning gold. The cypress trees are russet. The Virginia creeper holds the hackberry trees in a scarlet embrace. and the flame-leaf sumacs have set the meadow afire. Bill has finished the fall mowing, and the winter's firewood is stacked on the porch. Thoreau, this must be her dog, is ecstatic on these bright mornings, eager to chase the white-tailed deer that bed down every night in the east meadow. I watch them leap across the tall brown grasses and wonder how many of these beautiful animals won't be here this time next week. Deer season begins in a couple of days. Great little entry from Susan Wittig Albert. And then finally, I wanted to share this little passage with you before we get to botanical history. This one is by H.L.V. Fletcher, or Henry Luft Verne Fletcher, but he wrote under H.L.V. Fletcher. He also wrote under some pseudonyms, like my personal favorite of his, John Garden. What a great name. Anyway, here's what he wrote for October in his book called Purest Pleasure. And I was thinking about him this morning when I went to go to my physical therapy appointment for my knee, because they had some chrysanthemums outside, and I took a flower and I tested what he wrote here. I tested his theory. So he writes this about the chrysanthemum. It is a good many years since I discovered that chrysanthemum scent is stronger in its sap than in its flowers. I found that rubbing buds I had taken off during disbudding gave a much more aromatic perfume than any amount of sniffing at the flowers. And then last year, I made a further discovery. I picked up a dead chrysanthemum, dried and withered, and for no reason in particular, I smelled that. It had the scent to a much stronger degree than I have ever experienced. The petals, taken and rubbed in the palm of the hand, give a better fragrance than a whole chrysanthemum show of live flowers could ever give. I offer no explanation, though I was particularly struck by the experience. I imagine that in chrysanthemums, at any rate, the oil or whatever it is in the sap, which flows to the petals and does not to any great extent escape from them and remains in them even after the flower has died. So, a great little excerpt on chrysanthemums. All right, it's time for today's botanical history. Today we celebrate the birthday of Charles Wright, born on October 29, 1811, in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Wright embodied the spirit of botanical exploration in early America, becoming one of the most trusted plant collectors for the renowned botanist Asa Gray at the Harvard Herbarium. Perhaps no story better captures Wright's dedication than his remarkable 673-mile walk during the 1849 expedition from Galveston to El Paso. Picture this, a solitary figure trudging through the Texas wilderness, vasculum slung over his shoulder, collecting specimens in conditions that would discourage the hardiest of souls. Wright once wrote, "Sleep all night if you can in the rain, and walk 12 to 25 miles next day in the mud, and then overhaul a huge package of soaked plants and dry them by the heat of the clouds." Well, Wright's perseverance paid off magnificently. During this expedition alone, he collected 1,400 species. His discoveries included the beautiful Penstemon baccarifolius and the striking Castanea lanata, now known as woolly Indian paintbrush. As you walk through your garden today, consider the botanical pioneers like Charles Wright, who walked thousands of miles to document our native flora. And today we look back to October 29th, 1972, when a newspaper called the Berkshire Eagle published a revealing article about Henry David Thoreau, titled Thoreau, the Amateur Botanist. This piece was written by Wayne Hanley and drew heavily from the insights of respected naturalist Richard Jefferson Eaton of Barnstable, Massachusetts. Now, before I continue, I just want to mention as a side note that apparently the correct pronunciation of Henry David Thoreau's last name is Thoreau, not Thoreau. And so I know it takes some getting used to, but bear with me. As Eaton noted in his brand new book back in 1972, Thoreau's transformation from philosopher to botanist was both reluctant and profound. By 1852, Thoreau's journal entries began showing signs of internal struggle, the philosopher expressing alarm at his growing scientific tendencies. Yet 5 years later, by 1857, botany had won its place in his heart, achieving what Eaton called intellectual status and emotional acceptance. Now, Thoreau's sister Sophia played a pivotal role in this transformation, and she gently nudged her brother toward a more scientific approach to his beloved natural world. So, not unlike Joseph Banks' sister Sophie providing assistance to her brother, here we have Sophia Thoreau gently challenging her brother. Henry's botanical expeditions became increasingly sophisticated, and by August of 1860, Thoreau packed like a true botanist when he went out on these trips. He had a microscope, a plant press, blotting paper, and his trusted copy of Asa Gray's Manual on Plants. Fittingly, it was on this very day in 1858, as Thoreau was becoming more and more botanically minded, he wrote words that bridge his philosophical and botanical minds. He wrote, "Nature now, like an athlete, begins to strip herself in earnest for her contest with her great antagonist, winter. In the bare trees and twigs, what a display of muscle." Well, isn't that a novel and fantastic way to look at the bare branches that we're starting to see all around us? We only have a few leaves left on the trees here in Maple Grove, and even fewer up at the cabin. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, A Home in Bloom by Christy Purifoy. This book came out in April of 2023, and the subtitle is 4 Enchanted Seasons with Flowers. In this enchanting guide to bringing the garden indoors, Christy Purifoy takes us on a journey through 4 seasons, showing us how to transform our living spaces into living gardens. As someone who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Chicago, Purifoy brings both scholarly depth and poetic sensibility to her writing about flowers and home. And I thought you'd enjoy diving in to 2 particularly compelling passages from the book. First, Purifoy explores the very essence of what makes a house truly feel like a home. She wrote, "What makes a house a home? If the stories are to be believed, then a house becomes a home when it is brought to life like a velveteen rabbit, when it has an extra bit of magic like Hogwarts Castle, and when its purpose and aim is as clear as the dawn sought by Prince Caspian's voyaging ship." And it isn't only our children's stories that communicate this wisdom. The architect Christopher Alexander was well known for his insistence that good designs aren't those that merely look good on the pages of a magazine, but are those that feel alive. Aliveness is his term for what he calls the quality that has no name, which he also described as a kind of wholeness, spirit, or grace. If the whole earth is a garden, then our homes are also gardens within a garden. Yet we are used to thinking of the garden as an accessory to a house. It is a bonus, an extra. It is curb appeal. But gardens are much more than backdrops. Gardens are where our food comes from. Gardens are where beauty grows. Gardens are shelter. Gardens are where we walk with God and work our muscles. They are living works of art. What if you could live in a painting? What if you could stroll through a song? What if you entered a chapel or even a cathedral every time you went out to fetch the mail? A home in bloom is not a static thing, and it is not a barren place. It is constant change as seasons shift and children grow. And it is continuous return as the peonies bloom every spring and likely will for 100 years to come. A home in bloom is hard work at times, but it is the most satisfying, productive kind of work when anxieties slip from our shoulders with the rhythm of our rake, or as each seed falls from our fingers. Isn't that a great excerpt? That is how this whole book is, in addition to all of the wonderful projects. Purifoy's connection between literary references and the art of homemaking immediately draws us in. But perhaps even more intriguing is her practical wisdom about the gardening year. Purifoy divides her book into seasons, and she starts in autumn. She writes, "But enough of poetry. Let us talk of practicality. Autumn, it turns out, is the very best time of year for planting, despite the fact that garden centers seem to spend all their advertising power on bringing us through the doors in spring. This may be because plants are easier to sell in April. Who can turn away from a potted tulip in bloom or a crabapple tree in flower? Who among us isn't itching for a little time outdoors after a long winter spent inside? By the time autumn rolls around, I am sunburned and exhausted. I want only to turn the air conditioning off and the wood stove on. I want a cup of tea and a good mystery novel by the fire, not a few more hours earning blisters at the end of a spade. The papery, onion-like exteriors of a tulip bulb are hardly beautiful enough to entice most of us outside for a spot of gardening on a blustery mid-autumn day, which is a shame, because the brilliant colors of the spring garden depend on a willingness to risk chapped hands and wind-burned cheeks in order to plant those bulbs 6 inches deep. April flowers rely on roots that go all the way back to October. And in fall, despite the weather fronts that begin to cool the air, the soil is still warm from the summer sun, and most plants will gladly sink their roots in deep with the help of more frequent autumn rains to burst out of the starting gate in spring. I have begun to shift more and more of my planting to fall. The weather is generally more reliable than the dizzying way that spring careens between blizzards and heat waves. And by planting in fall, I have more time and energy for staying on top of the weeds in spring. After all, the permanent garden task of spring is keeping up with the weeds until the perennials grow in enough to smother them out. Well, this book is structured beautifully, and Purifoy offers specific projects for each of the seasons. So in autumn, for example, she talks about bulb planting and hydrangea drying, in addition to many other projects. In winter, she's writing about natural wreath making and forcing bulbs. In spring, a sampling of projects would include branch forcing and dandelion cupcakes. I liked that one. And then in summer, there are so many projects. Of course, here is where you'll see living centerpieces, but also fun things to do with the kids like floral ice cubes. This book is 256 pages of seasonal inspiration and practical guidance for bringing the garden's magic indoors. You can get a copy of A Home in Bloom by Christy Purifoy and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $8. All right, we end the show today with a Botanic Spark that celebrates the remarkable journey of Effie Almira Southworth Spaulding, who was born on this day, October 29th in 1860 in North Collins, New York. Effie's story illuminates both the challenges and triumphs of women in early American botanical science. The landscape for women in botany during the late 19th century was complicated. While it wasn't unusual for women to take an interest in botany, their roles were often limited to drawing or painting specimens or mounting samples. As one historical account notes, women pursued botanical collecting and filled college classrooms, although these interests rarely translated into a career in science. Many of these women were hobbyists and not paid professionally for their work. The resistance to women in scientific roles is perfectly captured in a 1909 letter from botanist G.P. Clinton to William Farlow at Harvard University. He wrote, "One thing that impressed me was that botany is getting effeminate again. Leastwise, there were more than the usual numbers of women botanists present. It wasn't bad when Flora Patterson was the only one, but now they have spread out into a dozen or more." Well, despite attitudes like this, Effie Southworth shattered expectations. In 1887, she became the first woman researcher hired at the USDA. Effie's scientific contributions were significant, including the first description of cotton anthracnose and the identification of a fungus, a plant pathogen, Coletotrichum gossypii. Effie collected and preserved 73 specimens that still reside in the USDA's National Fungus Collections today. Even marriage couldn't dim Effie's scientific pursuits, though it did alter their course. When Barnard College's policy against employing married women forced Effie's resignation in 1895, she simply redirected her expertise. She went on to study saguaro cacti at the Desert Botanical Laboratory, earned her master's degree at age 62, and continued adding to the University of Southern California's herbarium until just months before her passing at 87. Well, that's it for today's show. As October draws to a close, Today's stories remind us of the deep roots that connect all gardeners through time. From getting through our garden checklists of stacking firewood, running to yard waste, and turning the compost, to the botanical adventures of Charles Wright across the Texas wilderness, to Henry David Thoreau's transformation from philosopher to careful botanical observer, we see how the garden changes all who tend it. In Christy Purifoy's A Home in Bloom, we learned how to bring the garden's magic indoors, while Effie Southworth's pioneering spirit showed us how determination, like the hardiest of plants, can flourish against all odds. These stories, separated by decades, but united by a love of plants and discovery, remind us that whether we're clearing autumn gutters or making scientific breakthroughs, we're all part of gardening's continuing story. Each bulb we plant, each specimen we study, each moment we spend in wonder at nature's beauty adds another chapter to this endless tale. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.